Hi everyone and welcome back. Today we're continuing with part 2 of The Boy Who Grew Dragons by Andy Shepherd. Now if you've not yet caught part 1, check the description below and I'll post a link so you can get caught up with the story before you continue. Now last time, Thomas, our main character, had gone out to do some gardening with his granddad and found a very strange looking plant which had some very bizarre fruit on it. So let's see what happens next. Chapter 2. The Jam Roly-Poly of Doom. Is Grandad planning on growing potatoes on your head? Mum asked when I walked into the kitchen. She pointed to my hair. You've got half the garden in there. Shower now and be quick, tea's nearly done. I groaned, but there was no point in arguing, not when Mum had her I will not be moved even by a runaway rhinoceros look. But I didn't make it to the shower, and not just because I spotted the latest Spider-Man comic I'd left at the top of the stairs and stopped to check I hadn't missed anything the 6 times I'd already read it, but because when I went into my room to grab my dressing gown, I noticed something very odd. The dragon fruit was glowing, properly glowing. I went over and peered down at it. Reaching out, I prodded the spiky skin. It started pulsing orange, red and blazing yellow. Then I remembered what Grandad had said about mould. Maybe it was toxic. I yanked my hand back and stared at it, half expecting my fingers to shrivel up and drop off in some fatal reaction. They didn't, and the relief was slightly sprinkled with disappointment. Not because I wanted my fingers to fall off, but because when you've read as many comics as me, you can't help but hope that you might just absorb some superpowers when this kind of thing happens. Not that this kind of thing had ever happened to me. Ever. The fruit had stopped pulsing and now looked pretty normal, apart from the glow. Before I could prod it again, I heard Mum shouting from downstairs that tea was ready, and if no one was there to eat it in exactly 30 seconds, she was giving it all to next door's dog, and we could have cereal for all she cared. I might have taken more notice of this if the neighbours actually had a dog, which they don't, just a ferret, and a fussy one at that, so I doubt it'd eat Mum's lasagna anyway. Dad stuck his head around my door and shouted, "Tea up, Thomas!" then headed off down the hall. I waved. "Just coming, Dad." I didn't bother telling him he didn't need to shout. He wouldn't hear me. He wears a pair of massive headphones pretty much permanently. Music is Dad's job and his hobby, and what he does every second in between those times too. He writes music for commercials on TV, and one very low budget film that no one's heard of, let alone seen. But I secretly think he still wants to be a rock star and imagines being discovered by some TV talent show or something. Anyway, I've got used to communicating with him mainly through mime. Aware that I hadn't made it anywhere near the shower, I swapped hoodies, then ducked into the bathroom and quickly stuck my head under the tap. Looking at the state of the sink after I had finished, we'd probably be growing potatoes in there too. Mealtimes are interesting in our house. Not because we talk about interesting things or anything like that, but because of my not yet 3-year-old sister, Lolly. In particular, watching my parents trying to field the flying food and make sure some of it at least goes into Lolly's mouth. Plus, since it's the only time Dad doesn't wear headphones or isn't plugged into his keyboards, Mum seems to feel that she has to make the most of it by talking non-stop at about 100 miles an hour. No one could possibly process the amount of information she churns out in between mouthfuls. In fact, I'm pretty sure Daddy's actually composing tunes in his head while she's talking, and the nodding Mum takes for his agreement is just him keeping time. After Mum wiped up the lasagna that Lolly had generously shared with the floor, she brought out dessert. She's working her way through a cookbook Nana gave her last Christmas called Great British Puddings. That night it was jam roly-poly and custard. Well, lumps of custard. "The roly-poly's a bit flat," she noted as she offered it up to us apologetically. "It's meant to be a nice spiral of dough and jam, you know, rather than a splodge." She was right. It looked as if someone had sat on it, and that wasn't unusual. Mummy's a vet, you see, And although she can wrestle an uncooperative Doberman into a head cone, she can't seem to wrestle pudding ingredients into anything that resembles cake, despite all the shows she watches on TV. Of course, that could have had something to do with her leaving out half the ingredients to make it healthier. Sugar-free cake is not cake in my book. But being bombarded with shows about producing the perfect pudding, while at the same time being programmed to make sure everyone eats their 5 a day of fruit and veg, makes desserts more difficult for Mum than for the rest of us. I wanted to say something nice to make her feel better, but I'm really not great at lying. Dad was staring out of the window, humming under his breath. I needed him to step in quick before I blurted out something that would probably end up making Mum hurl the whole dish at the wall, which was not necessarily a bad idea. Just then, Lolly grabbed a piece and stuffed it into her mouth, and then spat it out. Mum looked horrified. We watched as Lolly picked up another piece, unravelled the dough, and happily started licking the jam out of the middle. "See? Lolly likes it," I spluttered. Mum didn't look convinced, so I dived for a piece and started making what I hoped were believable yummy noises. Mum sighed and just said, "Can't you call her Charlotte for once?" "But she likes being called Lollybob. Don't you, Lollybob Bobalob?" I replied, still chewing a tasteless lump of dough. Lolly giggled and stuck out 2 jammy hands to me. "See?" I said, finally managing to swallow the leaden ball of dessert. It lodged in my throat and I had to take an enormous gulp of water to get it down. Mum turned, and while she was wiping Lolly clean, I grabbed the rest of the roly-poly pudding from my bowl and stuffed it in my hoodie pocket. Thanks to my sister, I was going to be saved from eating any more. We stick together, me and Lolly, even without jam. Suddenly, there was a loud thump from upstairs. Mum stared at the ceiling. "Whatever's that?" "Probably just Tom Tom messing with my stuff," I said. "That cat is like a furry wrecking ball," Mum moaned. "Go and sort out your pet, Thomas." I didn't need telling twice, not with half a roly-poly still sitting on the table staring at me menacingly. I raced upstairs. "Tom Tom, come out," I said crossly as I stepped into my room. I looked around for the ginger cat, ready to give him his marching orders, but he wasn't anywhere to be seen. Then I noticed the dragon fruit wasn't where I'd left it on the desk. It was on the floor by my bed. And what's more, it had grown. Chapter 3. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Is it super maggot? So now the dragon fruit was glowing and growing. I decided it was best to keep it out of sight of Mum and Dad and away from Tom Tom, so I pulled out one of the storage drawers from the wooden unit that was crammed with all my toys. Shoving a heap of little plastic play figures to either side, I placed the fruit inside. My hands came away covered in sticky goo, like it was oozing juice or slime. Remembering the possibility of toxic meltdown, I quickly wiped my hands. Then I crawled into bed, eyes fixed on the drawer and the glow coming from inside. To be honest, it wasn't the behaviour I'd come to expect from fruit. I mean, bananas and mangoes never did this sort of thing. Even with kiwi fruit, you knew where you were. But this, frankly, it was weird. I had every intention of keeping a close watch on the fruit, but after all the digging and wrestling with the bongleweed, I was so tired my nighttime vigil probably lasted about 3.5 minutes. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when my eyes suddenly snapped open. The room was dark, but there was still a glow from the drawer. Suddenly, the whole wooden unit began to shake and rattle. That must have been what woke me. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. I peeled back the covers and crept out of bed. I switched on my rocket lamp and crouched down next to the drawer. Slowly, I opened it and peered in. The fruit sat there, glowing but unmoving. Had I been imagining things? I rolled my eyes at my own crazy imagination. and then checked the room for the unicycling gorilla who usually turns up in my dreams. But there was no gorilla, which meant this was no dream. I turned back to the fruit and then jumped in alarm as it began to move, shaking the drawer again. And this time I clearly saw one side of it bulge. It was as if something inside was trying to burst out. The skin stretched and the spiky leaves stuck out as the bulge moved under the surface. I thought of the worm I'd once found in a pear from Grandad's garden. What if some kind of monstrous maggot was squirming its way out of the dragon fruit? The thing twisted and writhed and pushed. I started to back away. There was no way I wanted a mutant maggot launching at my face. But as I took another step, I stumbled over King Kong and came crashing to the floor. I kept my eyes fixed on the still rattling drawer, and then there was an almighty pop. Like a cork from a bottle, something shot over my head. A spray of messy pulp and little black seeds covered the floor and splattered my trouser leg. For a second, I just lay there, eyes pinned wide open. Then I heard scratching and a noise like someone striking a match. I spun around, eyes scanning the floor to see where the maggot, or whatever it was, had landed. But all I could see were the toys I hadn't put away. There was the scratching sound again, like the fizzle of a match igniting. Whatever was making the sound was behind my beanbag. The match struck for a third time. I edged closer, keeping my eyes firmly on the mound of the beanbag. As I bent towards it, one edge moved. There was something wriggling underneath, trying to squirm its way out. Where was Tom Tom when I needed him? He'd left enough sad little critters on my carpet over the years as presents. He'd definitely know what to do with some kind of mutant fizzing worm. My heart was hammering in my chest. I'd have run a mile, but if I took my eyes off it, it might slink away, and then I'd have to go back to bed knowing it could be anywhere in the room with me. I grabbed a mug from the desk and stood up, ready to trap whatever it was. Slowly, and very, very gingerly, I lifted a corner of the beanbag. Every bit of me was poised, ready to jump out of my skin if the thing came shooting out at me. I lifted the beanbag higher, millimetre by millimetre, until I saw it, lying curled underneath. The mad hammering in my chest started to calm as I gazed down at the tiny creature in front of me, which was most definitely not a mutant maggot. Although quite what it was, I had no idea. It looked like a bird, but it had a thorny little spines down its back, and it seemed more leathery than feathery. It was bright red, and its wings were scalloped, a bit like a bat's, and it shimmered in the light of my rocket lamp, like it was having trouble deciding on the very best shade of red to be. As I stood there, my mouth gaping, it raised its head, swung it from side to side, and sneezed. Only what came out wasn't spit and bogies, but a bright little spark and a wheeze of smoke. And that's when my brain woke up and I knew, for sure and no messing, that what was nestled in my Batman dressing gown, scratching its claws across Robin's head as it hopped from foot to foot, was an actual dragon. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of The Boy Who Grew Dragons. Let's see what happens. Now Thomas has got a real life dragon in his bedroom. Join me for part 3 next time. Thank you for watching. Bye.